You ever walk into your own house and feel like a stranger? The first thing I noticed wasn't the light. It was the smell, fresh wood smoke curling through the cold mountain air like someone had just stoked the fireplace. And that made no sense because I hadn't been up here in over 6 months. Not since winter sealed off the ridge with 3 feet of snow and silence. Not since I locked every door, checked every window, and left my father's cabin exactly the way he built it, untouched, respected mine. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped closer, each sound too loud against the stillness. And then I heard it, a dull metallic clink from inside, like a pan hitting a stovetop, followed by the faint creak of floorboards that I knew better than my own heartbeat. And suddenly the cold didn't feel like weather anymore. It felt like warning. I stopped at the base of the porch, staring at the front door, noticing details that didn't belong. The welcome mat was different, newer, cleaner. The kind you buy in town, not something that survives a mountain winter, and the curtains behind the window. Those weren't mine either, lighter fabric, pulled halfway shut like someone wanted privacy, but not suspicion. And that's when my chest tightened, not out of fear exactly, but something sharper, more focused, like a switch flipping inside my head. I moved to the side window, slow, controlled, keeping my breath steady as I leaned just enough to look in, and what I saw didn't hit me all at once. It came in pieces, wrong piece after wrong piece, stacking until it formed something undeniable. My kitchen table cleared off, a different set of dishes, a pot simmering on the stove, steam rising in thin white ribbons, and then a purse, designer, expensive, resting on the chair my dad used to sit in every morning with his coffee. And that's when it stopped being confusion and turned into something else entirely. I backed away from the glass, my boots sinking slightly into the damp dirt. And for a second I just listened, really listened, mapping the sounds inside, footsteps moving with confidence, not cautious, not temporary. Whoever was in there wasn't sneaking. They were living, like this place belonged to them, like my name wasn't on every legal document tied to this land, like the deed in my truck meant nothing. I felt the edge of anger then, but I didn't let it take over, not yet, because anger makes noise. And right now silence was doing more work for me than anything else. I stepped up onto the porch, each board groaning softly under my weight. Familiar, loyal, unchanged, and I reached for the door handle out of habit before stopping myself inches away, because something else caught my eye. The lock, it had been replaced. Not broken, not forced, replaced cleanly with a newer model, which meant whoever did this didn't just walk in. They settled in, made decisions, claimed space. My jaw tightened, and I knocked once, firm, controlled, the sound echoing through the cabin in a way that made everything inside go still for half a second, just enough to confirm they heard me. Footsteps approached, slower now, deliberate, and then the door opened, and standing there, framed by my own doorway like she'd been expecting me, was Linda Crawford, the HOA President, dressed like she was heading to a board meeting instead of standing in someone else's mountain home. Her expression calm, almost amused, like this was all perfectly reasonable. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't even step back. She just looked at me and said, "You shouldn't be here." Like I was the one out of place, like I'd wandered into something I didn't understand. And for a moment, the absurdity of it almost made me laugh. But I didn't. I just held her gaze, steady, quiet, letting her fill the silence with whatever justification she thought she had. Behind her, I could see more changes. Furniture shifted, boxes stacked, signs of permanence. And that told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, and decisions like that always come with assumptions, dangerous ones. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't give her the reaction she was probably used to getting. Instead, I let my eyes drift past her, over her shoulder, through the open space of the cabin, and out toward the narrow dirt road that wound down the mountain in a single, unbroken line. The only way in, the only way out, cutting through trees and rock and land that most people assumed was just part of the wilderness. Unclaimed, unimportant, but I knew better, because I'd walked every inch of it with my father, measured it, documented it, signed for it. Linda kept talking, something about violations, compliance, authority, but her words were background noise now, fading under a much clearer thought forming in my head, because she was standing in my house, acting like she had power, and the truth was, she didn't understand what power actually looked like up here. I nodded once, like I was considering what she said, like I might even agree, and then I took a slow step back off the porch, my boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, my eyes never leaving hers. And that's when I realized she hadn't looked behind me even once, not at the road, not at the land, not at the one thing that mattered most in this entire situation. She had no idea what she'd walked into. I did not go back inside. Not yet. Because the moment you step into a situation like that without understanding it, you lose leverage, and leverage was the only thing that mattered now. Instead, I turned away from the porch slowly, letting the boards settle back into silence behind me, and walked toward my truck parked 20 yards down the slope, every step deliberate, controlled, like I had already decided something even if I had not said it out loud yet. The cold air felt sharper now, cleaner, cutting through the smoke that still drifted from the chimney. And I could hear her behind me for a second, the door shifting, like she expected me to argue, to push back, to make this easy for her to frame as a confrontation. But I did not give her that. I just kept walking. When I reached the truck, I opened the door and paused, one hand resting on the frame, my eyes lifting toward the ridge line, following the narrow dirt road as it curved down the mountain in a long, quiet stretch of packed earth and loose gravel. The same road I had driven 100 times in every season. The same road my father used to say was the only thing keeping the world connected to this place. Most people saw it as access, convenience, something that came with the property. But that was never the full story. Not legally, not practically, and definitely not today. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a folded document. The edges, worn from being handled more than once. And I did not even need to read it again because I already knew what it said. I knew the boundaries, the coordinates, the exact language that described where my land began and where it ended, and more importantly, what fell entirely within it. That road was not shared, it was not county maintained, it was not HOA managed, it cut through my property from start to finish. A private access line that I had every right to control, restrict, or shut down. Entirely if I chose to, and standing there, with smoke rising behind me and someone else living inside my house like it was theirs, that choice stopped being theoretical. I leaned back against the truck for a moment, listening again, not to the cabin this time, but to everything else. The wind moving through the trees, the distant creak of branches shifting, the absence of any other vehicles, any other people, because up here, isolation was not a feeling, it was a fact, and facts like that change how situations unfold. I thought about what she said, about how confident she sounded, how certain she was that whatever authority she believed in would hold up out here. And I realized something simple but important. She was operating on rules that only existed where other people could enforce them, where visibility and proximity gave those rules weight. But up here, miles from the nearest paved road, those assumptions did not travel as well as she thought. I pushed myself off the truck and walked around to the bed, flipping open the tailgate with a soft metallic click, revealing tools I kept up here for maintenance, practical things, nothing dramatic, just what you need when you own land that does not take care of itself. And as I looked at them, I was not thinking about force or confrontation, I was thinking about structure, process, steps that could not be argued with because they were grounded in ownership, in documented rights, in the kind of quiet control that does not need to announce itself to be effective. Behind me, I heard the cabin door open again, this time followed by footsteps on the porch, slower, more cautious, and I did not turn right away. I let her stand there, let her watch me without understanding what she was looking at, because sometimes uncertainty does more than any explanation ever could. When I finally glanced back, she was leaning slightly against the doorframe, arms crossed, trying to read me, trying to decide if I was leaving or planning something, and I gave her nothing, just a neutral expression. A small nod like this was all temporary, like I might come back with someone else, play by her rules, but inside, the picture was already shifting into place. I closed the tailgate and walked back to the driver's side, climbing in without another word, the engine turning over with a low, steady rumble that seemed to echo a little louder than usual in the stillness. And as I pulled away, tires crunching over gravel, I did not look at the cabin again, not because it did not matter, but because I had already seen enough to understand exactly what needed to happen next. The road stretched out in front of me, narrow and quiet, disappearing into the trees as it wound down the mountain, and for the first time since I arrived. I was not reacting anymore. I was planning, step by step, detail by detail, using everything this place had given me over the years, every boundary, every line on a map that most people would never think twice about. Halfway down the slope, I slowed the truck and glanced at a specific bend in the road, a spot where the terrain tightened, where rock and earth funneled the path into a single manageable section. Not obvious unless you knew what you were looking for, but once you did, it stood out as the one place where control could be absolute, where access could be changed without affecting anything beyond it. I let the truck idle there for a second longer than necessary, studying the ground, the angle, the surrounding trees, calculating without writing anything down, because I had walked this stretch too many times to need measurements. And as I pressed the gas and continued down, one thought settled in clearly. Calm and unshakable, she believed she had taken my house, but she had not even noticed the one thing she could not live without. I did not stop at the bend. I kept driving all the way down to where the dirt road met the county line, where pavement finally replaced gravel and the world felt a little less isolated. But my mind stayed up there on that narrow stretch of land where everything funneled into one controllable point. I pulled over near an old service turnout, the kind most people would miss unless they needed it, and shut off the engine, letting the sudden silence settle in again as I reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the one I had not used in months. A local contractor who handled grading and small-scale excavation work for properties like mine, nothing flashy, just reliable equipment, and someone who understood land without needing a long explanation. When he answered, I kept it simple, gave him the location, described the section of road I needed work done on, and made it clear this was on private property, fully documented, no permits required beyond what I already had. And he did not ask many questions because people who work in these areas learn quickly when something is straightforward and when it is not. And this, legally, was as straightforward as it gets. We agreed on timing. Early the next morning, first light, before anyone from town would even think about heading up the mountain. And when I ended the call, I sat there for a moment longer, staring at the road stretching out in front of me, knowing that everything from this point forward would be about execution, not emotion. I started the truck again and drove into town, a small place where everyone recognized trucks more than faces, and I made 2 stops, one at a hardware store for materials that would not draw attention on their own, and another at a supply yard where I picked up a set of steel barriers that were usually used for temporary closures. Nothing permanent, nothing destructive, just enough to redirect access in a way that could not be ignored. As I loaded everything into the bed of the truck, I could feel the plan settling into something solid, not rushed, not reactive, but deliberate, each piece fitting into place without forcing it. By the time I headed back up the mountain, the sun was already starting to dip, casting long shadows across the trees and turning the road into alternating bands of light and dark. And as I drove, I paid attention to every detail again, the incline, the curves, the way the ground shifted under the tires, reinforcing what I already knew, that this was not just a path. It was a controlled line through terrain that did not offer alternatives. When I reached the cabin, I did not stop this time. I slowed just enough to glance toward the house, and I could see light through the windows, steady and warm, like someone had settled in for the evening, comfortable, unaware, and Linda was nowhere in sight, which told me she had fully committed to the illusion that this was hers now, that whatever authority she believed in would carry through the night without challenge. I kept driving past, continuing up the road to a small clearing I sometimes used to turn around larger vehicles, and I parked there, cutting the engine and stepping out into the cooling air, the temperature dropping fast the way it always does at this elevation, and I walked a short distance back toward that bend I had marked earlier, my boots pressing into the dirt as I studied the ground one more time in fading light. I crouched down, running my hand across the surface, feeling the compacted gravel, the edges where it met the surrounding earth, the slight slope that would help guide any loose material into place if it was shifted correctly. And I could already see it in my head, where the barriers would sit, where the grading would redirect the path just enough to make it impassable without altering anything beyond my own boundary. This was not about destroying access. It was about controlling it, legally, visibly, in a way that could not be argued against because it never extended beyond what I owned. I stood up and looked down the road toward the cabin, barely visible through the trees now. Just a faint glow marking where someone else was living inside a space that carried my name on every record that mattered. And for a second, I wondered if she would notice anything before morning, if she would sense that something had shifted even without seeing it yet. But then I let that thought go because it did not change anything about what was coming next. I walked back to the truck, checking the equipment one more time, making sure everything was ready for when the contractor arrived. And as I closed the tailgate, the sound echoed slightly in the quiet, a small signal that the preparation phase was over. I got back into the driver's seat but did not start the engine right away. Instead, I sat there in the dark, hands resting on the wheel, looking out at the narrow stretch of road that connected everything: the cabin, the land, the choices that had already been made without understanding the consequences. After a few seconds, I finally turned the key, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum. And as I pulled away from the clearing to head back down for the night, one detail stayed clear in my mind: not the cabin, not the conversation, but that single point on the road where everything could be decided without a word. I woke up before the sun, not because of an alarm, but because something in my head had already moved on from thinking to doing. And when I stepped outside, the air was sharp and thin, the kind that carries sound farther than it should. And for a moment, everything was still, just the faint rustle of trees and the distant echo of nothing else, exactly how I needed it. I drove up the mountain while the sky was still a dull gray, the headlights cutting through low fog that hugged the road in patches, and every turn felt familiar in a way that made the plan feel less like a reaction and more like something that had been waiting to happen. By the time I reached the lower turnout, the contractor's truck was already there, parked off to the side with a small excavator on a trailer behind it, engine idling low, a quiet mechanical presence that fit into the landscape without drawing attention. He stepped out as I pulled in, gave me a nod instead of a greeting, the kind of acknowledgement that comes from understanding that not every job needs a conversation, and I walked him through the section I had in mind, pointing out the exact stretch where the road narrowed, where the terrain would naturally support a controlled shift without affecting anything beyond my boundary line. I showed him the markers, the subtle changes in elevation, the way the ground would settle if we redirected the top layer. And he listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at the slope, the tree line, the angles, confirming what I already knew, that this could be done cleanly, legally, and without creating anything that could be interpreted as damage beyond my own property. We went over it once more, not because it was complicated, but because precision mattered. And then he started unloading the equipment, the metal ramps clanking softly as they hit the dirt, the excavator rolling down with a controlled hum that blended into the quiet morning instead of breaking it. I stepped back and watched as he positioned the machine, the arm extending slowly as he tested the ground, making small adjustments before committing to anything. And I appreciated that, because this was not about rushing. It was about making sure that every movement aligned with what the land would support. As the first bucket pressed into the gravel, there was no dramatic shift, just a gradual change, the top layer being pulled back and redirected. The path subtly reshaped in a way that would not be obvious from a distance, but would become undeniable the moment someone tried to pass through it. I moved a few feet away, setting up the steel barriers I had brought, placing them at angles that worked with the terrain rather than against it, creating a visual and physical signal that the road was no longer open in the way it had been before. The work continued in steady, controlled motions, the excavator carving just enough of a change into the roadbed to break the continuity, turning a straight path into something that required permission to navigate, not force. The sun started to rise behind the trees, casting light across the area in thin lines that highlighted the changes as they took shape. And for a moment, standing there, it almost looked like nothing had happened, like the road was still what it had always been. But I knew better, and anyone who tried to drive through would know it too. After a while, the contractor shut down the machine and stepped back, looking over the work with the same quiet assessment he had when we started, and he nodded once, satisfied that everything matched the plan, that nothing extended beyond what was necessary, that the boundary between access and control had been redrawn without crossing any line that did not belong to me. I handed him the payment. We exchanged a few final words about the condition of the soil and how it would settle over the next few days, and then he loaded up, the equipment reversing up the ramps with the same controlled precision, and within minutes, his truck was heading back down the mountain, leaving the road in a state that looked almost unchanged to anyone who did not understand it. I stood there alone again, the quiet returning as the engine noise faded, and I walked the stretch one more time, checking the placement, the angles, the way the barriers aligned with the natural flow of the land, and everything held exactly as it should. When I reached the edge of the modified section, I turned and looked up the road toward the cabin, still hidden behind trees and distance, but close enough that I could picture the light in the windows, the movement inside, the assumption that nothing outside had shifted overnight. I did not need to go back up there yet, not until the change had time to reveal itself on its own, because sometimes the most effective move is the one that lets the other person discover the reality without being told. I took a slow breath, letting the cold air settle in my lungs, and then I started walking back toward my truck, leaving the road exactly as it needed to be, knowing that the next time someone tried to leave, they would not get very far. I did not go back to the cabin that morning, not right away, because the moment only works if it unfolds without you standing there forcing it. So I drove down the mountain again, slow and steady, letting the distance build while knowing exactly what was happening behind me, or more accurately, what was about to happen. By the time I reached town, the sun was fully up, casting that clean, bright light that makes everything look ordinary, and I spent the next few hours doing things that felt almost routine, grabbing coffee, checking a few emails, keeping my movements predictable, because there is something powerful about appearing unaffected when everything is already in motion. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed for the first time, an unknown number, local area code, and I let it ring out, watching the screen without answering, because timing matters just as much as action. A minute later, it buzzed again, same number, more insistent this time, and I still did not pick up, not yet, because I could already picture where she was, standing halfway down that road, looking at something that did not match what she expected, trying to reconcile authority with reality. The third call came less than 30 seconds later, and this time I answered, bringing the phone to my ear without saying anything at first, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to fill it. "You need to fix this." Linda's voice came through, tight, controlled, but carrying an edge that was not there yesterday, the confidence still present but thinner now, like it was being tested in real time. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the quiet street, and said calmly, "Fix what?" Not because I did not know, but because I wanted her to define the problem in her own words. There was a pause, short but noticeable, and then she spoke again, faster this time, explaining that the road was blocked, that access to the property had been compromised, that this was unacceptable, and that as the president of the HOA she expected immediate resolution. I listened without interrupting, letting her lay out every assumption she was still holding on to, every belief that the rules she relied on extended beyond where they actually applied. And when she finished, I waited a second longer before responding, keeping my voice even, almost neutral. "That road runs through my land," I said, simple, factual, not argumentative. Another pause, longer this time, and I could hear something shift on the other end. Not panic, not yet, but a recalibration, like she was realizing that the framework she was using did not fully cover this situation. "You cannot just block access like that," she replied, the edge sharpening again, trying to regain control through certainty, and I nodded to myself even though she could not see it, because that was exactly where she was mistaken. "I did not block access," I said, choosing each word carefully. "I adjusted my property, and I let that sit there, because the difference between those two statements was everything." She started to respond, something about regulations, about shared rights, about how the HOA governs the community, and I let her talk again, not correcting her, not arguing, just listening as she built a case that only worked if the underlying assumption was true, and up here, it was not. When she finally stopped, I spoke again, still calm, still steady. "You are on my property, Linda," I said, using her name for the first time, grounding the conversation in something more direct. "And the only road in and out of that property is also mine." And I did not raise my voice, did not add emphasis, because the statement did not need it. There was silence on the line after that, not empty, but full of processing. The kind that happens when someone realizes they are not in the position they thought they were. And for a moment, I wondered if she would pivot, if she would adjust her approach. But when she spoke again, it was still framed the same way, still reaching for authority instead of acknowledging reality. "We will involve legal if necessary," she said. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was a threat, but because it confirmed exactly where she was standing mentally, still looking outward for validation instead of recognizing what was already established. "You can do that," I replied, "but it will not change where that road sits." And I kept it there. No escalation, no challenge, just a clear boundary. Another pause followed, longer this time, and I could hear movement in the background on her end, gravel underfoot. Maybe her turning, maybe looking back up toward the cabin, measuring distance in a way she had not needed to before. And when she spoke again, the certainty was thinner, replaced by something closer to frustration. "I cannot get out," she said, more directly now, less formal, and that was the first time she framed it as a personal limitation instead of a procedural issue. I let a few seconds pass before responding, not to be dramatic, but to let the weight of that statement settle, because once someone says that out loud, it changes how they see the situation. "That is correct," I said finally, keeping my tone level, not confrontational, not sympathetic, just acknowledging the reality she had stepped into. The line stayed quiet for a moment after that, and I could almost picture her, standing there, looking at the road, the barriers, the subtle shift in the terrain that turned assumption into obstacle. And for the first time since this started, the situation was no longer theoretical for her. It was immediate, tangible, something she had to deal with directly instead of through policy or position. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, phone still at my ear, waiting to see what she would say next, because whatever came after this would tell me exactly how she planned to move forward and whether she understood what had actually changed. She did not hang up right away, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because people who still believe they are in control usually end conversations quickly. They issue a final statement, a warning, something definitive, but she stayed on the line, and I could hear it in the background, the subtle shift of gravel under her feet, the faint sound of wind cutting across the open stretch of road, and something else beneath it, something quieter, uncertainty starting to take shape. "This is not how this works," she said finally, her voice lower now, less performative, like she was no longer speaking as a president, but as someone trying to re-establish footing. And I leaned back again, letting that statement sit for a second before responding, because what she said was technically true, just not in the way she meant it. "Up there, it is exactly how it works," I replied, keeping my tone even, not correcting her directly, just reframing the reality she was standing in. There was a pause again, and this time it stretched longer, and I could almost map out her thoughts in real time. The shift from authority to logistics, from rules to limitations, because when someone realizes they cannot move freely, everything changes, priorities, tone, even the way they choose their words. "I have meetings today," she said, and that was the first time she introduced something external, something that depended on her ability to leave. And I could not help but notice how quickly the conversation moved from governance to schedule, from policy to personal inconvenience. "That sounds like a problem," I said, not dismissive, not sarcastic, just factual. And I left it there, because the more I filled the space, the more I would give her something to push against. And right now, she was doing that on her own. I heard her exhale on the other end, sharper this time. And then she tried a different angle. "If this is about compliance, we can discuss that like adults," she said, shifting toward negotiation without admitting she needed it. And I let a small silence follow before answering, because that was the closest she had come to acknowledging the situation without saying it outright. "This is not about compliance," I said. "This is about ownership." And I made sure that word landed clearly, because everything that had happened since yesterday traced back to that single point. Another pause followed, but this one felt different, less resistant, more measured, like she was starting to understand that the framework she had been using did not apply here in the way she expected. In the background, I could hear a car door open and close, maybe hers, maybe someone else's, but no engine followed, no movement, just more shifting gravel. And that told me she had already tried the obvious, already driven down to that bend, already seen what the road had become. "You cannot just leave me up here," she said. And there it was again, more direct this time. Stripped of titles and structure, just the situation as it existed, and I let that sit for a second, because the phrasing mattered, not what she accused me of, but what she assumed I was responsible for. I did not bring you there, I replied, still calm, still steady, and I could feel the balance of the conversation settling into something more defined now. Less about who had authority and more about who had made what choices. She did not respond immediately, and for a moment, the line was filled with nothing but the ambient sound of the mountain, wind, distant branches. The quiet that does not exist in town, and I knew that silence was doing more work than any argument could, because it forced her to sit with the reality without distraction. "What do you want?" she asked finally, and the shift in that question was subtle but important. Not a demand, not a directive, just a request for clarity, and I straightened slightly in my chair, because that was the point where the conversation moved from resistance to recognition. I did not answer right away, not to create tension, but to make sure that when I did, it was clear and simple, something that could not be misinterpreted or redirected. "I want my property back," I said, no extra words, no conditions attached, just the core of the situation stated plainly, and I could almost feel how that landed on her end, not as a surprise, but as something she had already anticipated and was hoping to avoid hearing directly. Another pause followed, shorter this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, not completely, but enough to signal that the conversation had moved into a different phase, one where the outcome was no longer something she could define on her own. "We will need to review the situation," she said, defaulting back to structure, to process, but without the same certainty that it would work in her favor, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that was fine. She could review whatever she wanted, consult whoever she needed, but none of that would change the physical reality she was standing in. "Take your time," I replied, keeping my tone consistent, not pressing, not escalating, because there was no need to rush what was already unfolding exactly as it should. The line stayed quiet for a moment longer, and then she ended the call without another word, not abruptly, but without closure either, like she had more to say but did not know how to frame it yet. I lowered the phone and set it on the table beside me, looking out the window again at the calm, ordinary scene in front of me, and for a moment, it almost felt disconnected from what was happening up on the mountain. But that was the point. Two different environments, two different sets of assumptions, and only one of them actually mattered right now. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, letting the silence settle again, knowing that the next move would not come from me, not immediately, because she still had to process what had changed, still had to decide how to respond now that the situation no longer fit into the structure she relied on. And somewhere up there, standing on a road that no longer led where she expected, she was starting to realize just how limited her options really were. The rest of the day passed without another call, and that silence told me she was not escalating yet. She was thinking, calculating, trying to rebuild control in a situation that no longer responded to her the way she expected, and by late afternoon I knew exactly what she would do next, not because she had many options, but because people like her always follow the same pattern when authority slips. They reach outward, they bring in others, they try to expand the frame until it feels familiar again. So I moved first, not emotionally, not reactively, just methodically. I went back to my truck, pulled out the folder I kept tucked behind the seat, and spread the documents across the hood: the original deed, the land survey, the easement records that clearly showed there was no shared access granted to any association. No clause, no exception, just a clean line of ownership that included the road from the base all the way to the cabin. I took photos of each page, clear, readable, time-stamped, and then I drafted a short message, not aggressive, not defensive, just precise, attaching the documents and sending them to the HOA board's official email, not to Linda directly, because this was no longer a conversation between two people. It was a matter of record. I kept the wording simple, stating that unauthorized occupancy had been observed on my private property, that access control had been exercised within my legal rights, and that any further action should be directed through proper legal channels. And then I sent it, not expecting an immediate response, but knowing it would land somewhere that could not be ignored. After that, I made one more call, this time to a local attorney I had worked with years ago when I first purchased the land. Someone who understood rural property law and did not need explanations about how access roads function in areas like this. And when he answered, I gave him a concise summary. No drama, just facts. And he confirmed what I already knew, that as long as I had not extended beyond my boundary and had not created a hazard outside my property, I was well within my rights to control access. When I ended that call, I felt the situation settle into something more formal, less personal, like it had moved out of the realm of assumption and into documentation, where things are harder to twist. As evening approached, I drove partway back up the mountain, not all the way to the cabin, just enough to get within sight of the section where the road had been adjusted, and I parked off to the side, engine off, watching the area from a distance, the light fading again into that soft gray that flattens everything into shapes and shadows. After a while, I saw movement, a vehicle approaching slowly from above, Linda's car, inching its way down the road until it reached the modified section, and then it stopped, just like I knew it would, sitting there for a long moment before the door opened, and she stepped out, her posture different now, less rigid, more cautious, like she was approaching something unfamiliar. She walked forward, looking at the ground, the barriers, the subtle shift in the roadbed, and even from this distance I could tell she was trying to understand it, not just physically but conceptually, trying to find the part where she could argue against it, where she could reframe it into something she had authority over. But there was nothing there for that, just land and a boundary she had not considered before. She pulled out her phone, pacing slightly as she made a call, probably to someone on the board, maybe to legal, maybe to someone she thought could override what she was seeing. And I stayed where I was, not hiding, just not inserting myself into the moment, because this was hers to experience without interruption. After a few minutes, she hung up and stood there, looking back up the road toward the cabin, then down again toward the exit, measuring distance in a way she had never needed to before, and for the first time since this started, there was no performance in her movement, no attempt to project control, just a person standing in a situation that did not bend to expectation. I watched for a little longer, then started my truck again, the engine low and steady, and as I pulled away, I did not need to see what she would do next, because the pattern had already shifted, the conversation had already moved beyond where she could dictate it alone. Back down in town, my phone buzzed again, this time with multiple notifications, emails coming in from the HOA board, formal, measured, asking for clarification, requesting documentation, acknowledging receipt of what I had sent earlier, and I read through them without responding immediately, letting them stack for a moment, because timing still mattered. Even here, I set the phone down on the table and leaned back, the room quiet around me, and for the first time since I walked up to that cabin, everything felt aligned, not because the situation was over, but because it had reached a point where the outcome would follow the structure already in place, not anyone's opinion. And somewhere up that mountain, standing between a house she claimed and a road she could not use, she was starting to understand that this was no longer something she could talk her way out of. The emails kept coming through the evening, each one more careful than the last, the tone shifting from casual authority to measured concern, board members asking for clarification, referencing bylaws, trying to position themselves somewhere between Linda and the situation without committing to either side. And I let them sit for a while before responding, not out of hesitation, but because timing still shaped how this would unfold. When I finally replied, I kept it simple, attaching the same documents again, highlighting the exact section that defined the road as entirely within my property lines, and I added one line that mattered more than anything else, that unauthorized occupancy was occurring and that I was requesting immediate resolution before further legal action became necessary. I sent it to the entire board, not just one person, because transparency removes the space where assumptions grow. Less than an hour later, my phone rang again, this time a different number, and when I answered, the voice on the other end introduced himself as one of the board members, his tone polite but cautious, like someone stepping into a situation that had already moved beyond internal control. He asked if we could discuss a temporary solution, something that would allow access while the matter was reviewed, and I could hear it in his voice, not authority, not confidence, just an attempt to stabilize something that was already tilting. I listened, then responded the same way I had all day, calm, precise, Access was never removed beyond my property rights, I said. And the situation exists because someone chose to occupy land they do not own. And I let that sit there, because every time they tried to reframe it, I brought it back to the same point. There was a pause, followed by a quiet acknowledgement, and then he said they would be sending someone up to assess the situation directly. Not HOA enforcement, but a neutral party, and that was the first time. The structure shifted away from Linda entirely. The next morning, I drove back up the mountain again, not all the way to the cabin, just far enough to see the road from a distance, and within minutes I saw another vehicle approaching from below, a county-marked SUV moving slowly, carefully, like the driver already understood that this was not a routine stop. It reached the modified section and stopped, just like Linda had, and a man stepped out, clipboard in hand, looking over the road, the barriers, the terrain, taking his time in a way that told me he was not there to react. He was there to verify. A few minutes later, another vehicle appeared from above, Linda's again, coming down slowly, stopping a few yards behind the first, and when she stepped out this time, her posture was different, less rigid, more measured, like she had already adjusted to the fact that this was no longer something she controlled. I stayed where I was, watching the interaction from a distance, the two of them speaking near the edge of the road, the official pointing to the ground, the slope, the placement of the barriers, and even without hearing the words, I could tell what was happening. He was mapping it against the boundaries, confirming what belonged where, and whether anything extended beyond it. Linda gestured a few times, sharper movements, like she was trying to emphasize impact, inconvenience, something that would shift the interpretation, but the official remained steady, neutral, focused on the physical reality rather than the argument. After a while, he stepped back, looked down the road toward the base, then back up toward the cabin, and finally nodded once, a small motion, but enough to signal that he had reached a conclusion. He said something to Linda, something that made her go still for a second, and then she looked down at the road again, not in confusion this time, but in recognition. Like the explanation had finally aligned with what she was seeing, I did not need to hear the words to understand the outcome, because it was already built into the situation, the land, the documents, the boundaries that had not changed no matter how she framed them. The official returned to his vehicle after a few more notes, the engine starting with a low hum before he slowly turned around and headed back down the mountain, leaving Linda standing there for a moment longer, alone again on that stretch of road. She did not call me right away this time, and that told me everything had shifted, not just in terms of what she could do, but in how she understood where she stood, because now it was not just my word against hers, it was confirmed, documented, something external that did not bend to internal authority. I stayed a little longer, watching as she eventually got back into her car, sat there for a few seconds, and then turned it around, heading back up toward the cabin instead of down, because there was nowhere else to go. I started my truck and drove back down again, not rushing, not lingering, just moving with the same steady pace as before, because at this point, the situation was no longer about proving anything. It was about letting it resolve along the lines that were already set. By the time I reached town, my phone buzzed again, another email from the board, shorter. This time, more direct, stating that they had reviewed the situation and would be addressing the occupancy issue immediately, and I read it once, then set the phone down without replying, because there was nothing left to clarify. Somewhere up that mountain, in a house that was never hers and on land she never understood, she was finally being told what I had known from the beginning. The next morning felt different before I even got in the truck, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with the mountain and everything to do with the fact that the situation had already tipped, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that does not reverse once it settles. I drove up just after sunrise, the light cutting through the trees in long, narrow beams, and when I reached the section of road I had adjusted, nothing had changed physically. The barriers still stood where I placed them. The ground held its new shape, but the meaning of that space had shifted. It was no longer a point of conflict. It was a confirmed boundary. I continued past it this time, walking the rest of the way up toward the cabin on foot, the gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm that felt familiar again, like the place was slowly returning to something I recognized. As the house came into view, the first thing I noticed was the stillness, no movement inside, no sound of anything being used or rearranged. just the quiet presence of a place waiting. And when I stepped onto the porch, the door was slightly open, not wide, just enough to show that whoever had been inside was no longer holding it closed against me. I pushed it the rest of the way and stepped in, the air inside carrying a mix of what had been there before and what had been added temporarily, the scent of unfamiliar products fading under the deeper smell of wood and stone that had always belonged here. The changes were still visible, different items placed where mine used to be, small adjustments that tried to make the space feel owned. But there was something else now too, a sense of interruption, like whatever had been started here had not been completed. On the kitchen table, there was a folder, neatly placed, not hidden, not scattered, just set there as if it was meant to be found. And I walked over, opening it without hesitation, finding a short written note inside. No signature, but it did not need one. The wording was formal, restrained, acknowledging that the occupancy had been a misunderstanding of jurisdiction, that the situation would be resolved without further escalation, and that access to the property would be returned immediately. I read it once, then closed the folder and set it back down, not because I needed to keep it, but because it marked the point where everything that had been implied was now stated, even if indirectly. I moved through the cabin slowly after that, not checking for damage, not inspecting anything in detail, just letting my eyes pass over the space, recognizing what was mine and what had been brought in temporarily. And by the time I reached the back window, looking out over the slope and the line of trees beyond, it felt like the place had already started to reset itself. Outside, I heard the faint sound of a vehicle in the distance, not close, just enough to carry through the quiet, and I stepped back onto the porch, watching as a car moved slowly along the upper part of the road, heading away from the cabin, not toward the exit, but toward a side path that eventually reconnected lower down, a longer route, less direct, but one that did not cross the section I controlled. It was not efficient, not convenient, but it was movement, and that told me everything had already been decided without needing another conversation. I leaned against the railing for a moment, feeling the wood under my hand, solid, unchanged, and I thought about how quickly the situation had shifted, not because of force, not because of confrontation, but because the structure underneath it had always been there, waiting to be recognized. I went back inside, picked up a few of the items that did not belong, setting them aside near the door without urgency, because there was no longer a need to rush anything. And then I walked through each room once more, opening windows, letting fresh air move through, clearing out what did not fit without making a scene of it. When I stepped outside again, I pulled the door closed behind me, this time locking it with the original key, feeling the mechanism settle into place the way it always had. Simple, reliable, mine. I stood there for a second longer, looking out at the land stretching beyond the porch, the same view I had seen for years, unchanged by everything that had just happened. And that was the part that mattered most, not the conflict, not the resolution, but the fact that ownership does not need to be loud to be absolute. I turned and walked back down the path toward the road, my steps steady, unhurried, and when I reached the section where everything had shifted, I paused briefly, not to admire it, not to reconsider it, just to acknowledge it for what it was, a line that had been invisible until someone crossed it. Then I kept walking, continuing down the mountain, leaving the cabin exactly where it belonged, knowing that nothing about it needed to be defended anymore.